Yo, what's up everyone? My name is Zenitsu, and we are back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be kind of doing a very loose approach to a video I have done in the past, which is the end of format review, where I kind of just look at the format as a bigger picture and kind of take the information that we do have available to us and see if the meta was actually a good and enjoyable format and the overall current health and state of the game. But again, with the data sets being so limited, we can't necessarily get the full picture and full understanding, but we have what we have, and that's what we have to work with, unfortunately. I would like to look at like conversion rates and play rates of various other decks, just to see like what truly is doing well, but unfortunately, this is all that we have to work with. I'm not saying that Eggman Events is doing a bad job, it's just he's only limited by what Bandai is allowed to want to give him. And I'm not saying it's Bandai specifically, it's more specifically the TOs, but the TOs need to get Bandai's permission. But I digress. And we do have still some information to look at to be able to kind of discern our own opinion on how we're going to be utilizing this data in terms of looking at the big macro state of Digimon. So I went ahead and added all of the top decks up for BT 22.5 and EX10. And yes, it might be disingenuous to lump EX10 with BT 22.5, but usually the pattern is EX sets don't necessarily change or shake up the meta that dramatically. So I just decided to lump them together to be able to get like some kind of a picture, because as you can see, outside of literally one deck, the format basically has not changed. So yeah, that's perfectly fine on why I decided to add both of those formats together. And I'm excluding BT22 like pre-ban list, because again, that was pre-ban list, and the ban list was supposed to try to shake and change things up a lot. Even though, like, as you could see between like what a lot of the top decks are, it really hasn't changed that much since the ban and restriction list, so I don't necessarily think, based on actually taking a look at the game as a whole in the bigger picture, the ban and restriction list did anything at all. It did do stuff, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it did enough to reasonably change the game in a meaningful capacity. So, going back to this list, you do obviously still have other decks that are able to top, but most of the time these kind of just feel like got luckies versus something that actually is more consistently topping. And it is also important to take a look at what Japan is doing, because Japan still does and currently is playing the same game we are. Yes, Japan does play a little bit differently, because not all of the players that are playing in the Japanese format are playing best of ones. Some of them still are playing best of threes, so that is important to talk about. But when it comes to talking about Japan as a whole and the Japanese format as a whole, they do tend to just post locals. They don't have any big 100+ person event, and if they do, it's maybe like once a season. So it's not like I can really hold a lot of credibility to Japanese events, because it's all basically just local level data. And we don't even keep track of our own local level data. We could if we wanted to, but again, it's easier for a weaker deck to be able to top a event if there's not that much competition. So it's just like, oh, you look at where Japan is coming from, and they're playing a lot of the new stuff, to be honest. Like, you have Rocks and Minerals, you have Myotismon, you have Blackwood Greymon, you have Beelzemon, you have Bagramon, like, all in the top 10s. And I'm not saying those are bad decks. Obviously, Rocks and Minerals is doing well here as well. But I'm just saying, usually Japan likes to try to play the new and shiny stuff versus what's actually going to be good. And they don't actually have the ability to prove if something is good or not outside of just, you know, their local level data without a big 100-man super major or whatever. So even though this is still important to note where Japan is coming from and what they're doing, I don't hold a whole lot of credibility to it, because it's basically like if I were to include my locals level data in with like big major events. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because they're two completely different data sets. But I digress. And as far as where this current format is, I don't personally think it's in the greatest of states. So this is just my opinions. You could say, oh, look, there's 20 different decks that were able to top in this format. That's great. Look at the diversity. That's so healthy. And I always like to bring the counter argument that there is more to the health of the game than just diversity. Like, I'm not just going to just shit on the game as a whole. That's not the point of this video, but I do want to acknowledge that diversity is not the end-all be-all when it comes to the health of the format, because, again, if you look at these decks, they haven't topped consistently. They haven't proven themselves to actually be good past their one-off showing at a larger event. These are the decks that were able to consistently show up and be good and take multiple slots in multiple events. So that means there's more to what these decks are doing than what these decks are doing. Not trying to discredit any of these decks, but again, we don't necessarily have that much data to actually discern to see proper power levels of actual decks outside of how many times they're able to top. But again, I'm not trying to say that these are all bad decks. They were still able to have topped, and that's worth something. But again, there's a big difference between topping repeatedly and topping once. So I think that there is something to be said between what these decks are doing and what these decks are doing. Even though these decks are still trying to basically be as consistent and powerful as these decks, it's just obviously something isn't quite there that's propelling them forward to be some of the better decks. But when it comes to the macro level play patterns, in order for a deck to be competitive, obviously, when it comes to any competitive game, not specifically just Digimon, the whole idea is to optimize the fun and player agency out of the game, and that doesn't necessarily leave for the best of play patterns. So when it comes to just what some of these decks are doing, and again, this extends to not just these, but a lot of Digimon decks as a whole, usually, Machinedramon and Genkumon are the best examples of trying to remove player agency away from the opponent because they just are big immune bodies that you can't reasonably interact with. Like, sure, you could kind of interact with Machinedramon, but most of the time he's going to have enough resistance to be able to still stick around no matter what, and that's kind of frustrating knowing that I need to get rid of this card, and I reasonably can't interact with him in a way that is going to let me achieve that goal, and because you didn't achieve that goal, that's a psychological failure put onto you, and it doesn't necessarily make you feel very good or accomplished, at least in this middle of the game, and when that happens repeated, it feels incredibly defeating, and that's not necessarily the best feeling, knowing that you didn't have the ability to actually do anything about the game, no matter how much effort you tried to put into your plays to be able to get the end result you wanted. So that's kind of where Genkumon also is, because again, it's just adding floodgates into the mix, where Machinedramon actually is a little bit more kind of fair in a perspective, where you could still try to do stuff, it's just Machinedramon's going to make it difficult. But regardless, when it comes to the rest of the decks, they kind of are just big dumb OTK decks, and they're not necessarily all pure OTK decks. Like, they have other aggressive playlines that don't just end the game on the spot. Most of the time they don't, but at the end of the day, they try to leave such a big gap in terms of board state where there's no reasonable ability to actually either A, interact, or B, come back from the game because of how big and oppressive of a board state that they're trying to end and leave things on. So that's what Gallantmon's doing, that's what Omnimon's doing, is if they can't punch through all of the opponent's security to win the game, they're just going to make it very hard for the opponent to then try to come back from. Megidramon is trying to be this big dumb OTK deck, but at least like it has this weird little loop where if it doesn't win the game, then it still just resets and has a lot of pieces and ability to be able to rebuild very quickly and efficiently. Galaxy's kind of this weird anomaly where it's actually just trying to leverage high-end floodgates to basically take the opponent's ability to even play the game to begin with out of their hands. So as long as Galaxy is able to basically kind of like move out first and be able to set itself up reasonably, there's not a whole lot that the opponent's going to be able to do if they're playing towards their deck's overall strength and they're using the correct floodgates. Then when it comes to rocks and minerals, they're kind of taking that same style approach where, again, if they're not able to OTK, then they're going to try to leave off on a floodgate to stall out and slow down the opponent, so that way the next turn, they 100% should be able to win the game from that point forward. And Leviamon is kind of in a similar spot where it does have the ability to OTK. Like, all of these decks have insane amounts of damage output to basically finish the game off in 2 turns, if not the single turn that they need when they go up into their big boss monster, but they usually have some kind of reactive playline that enables them to be even more effective when they can't OTK. Red Purple Imperial, again, is in that same exact camp where it goes up into its big Digimon, has lots of aggression thanks to all of the DNA and free playing of extra bodies, and it even has a 1-card combo starter to be able to reset itself in case it does end up getting deleted, to be able to re-go up and do everything all over again. And then Purple Hybrids is very similar to Megidramon, where you go up into your main body, and then you're expecting your main body to die, and then when it dies, you reset everything, and you can continue the aggression more passively that way, or you just chip, and then you have the ability to line up a whole bunch of extra attacks, whether it's digivolving to a level 5, and then getting the extra attack off the level 5, or just abusing the same Gallantmon cards that Gallantmon and Megidramon are using to be able to get extra free bodies out of nowhere, and then just continue rushing from there. And like, that's like the big thing that even these lower decks are still doing. They're still exemplifying those similar styles of play. It's just they're doing it a little bit less consistently, and it might take a little bit longer, or it's a little bit harder to be able to get them into those positions. And the last playstyle I want to talk about is going to be one that hasn't been doing super well, but still incredibly relevant to a deck's overall success, and that's the ability to play out of nowhere. And what I mean by that is you could have borderline almost nothing on your field, and then you could just hard slam a high-level Digimon and try to react and respond to the opponent, or use that high-level Digimon to be able to try to win the game with on the spot. So you have decks like 7 Great Demon Lords and Royal Knights that are both able to do that, utilizing their clock-style mechanics, and other decks are able to do that as well, utilizing their own clock-style mechanics. Or you have the cross variants, where you're going to basically utilize the ability to combine Digimon into a single one, utilizing either your hand, your trash, or stuff underneath your tamers, wherever it's going to be used from. The fact that you could just hard play a high-level Digimon for cheap, have it have full inheritables, on top of the fact that it's also going to try to out whatever the opponent is doing, is incredibly strong of a game plan to do. So multiple different decks that are able to do well can employ any of these high-level strategies to be able to find success. And again, it's just the ones that are able to set it up more consistently, and the mechanics and abilities that they're playing with are going to be the big differentiating factors on what's a deck that's actually going to be doing well versus what's not going to be doing well. Because if we actually start talking about some of the nitty-gritties to this format more specifically, you have, let's just say, the leader of the pack being Machinedramon plays a card like Vademon. Vademon is a card that not only just has built-in protection, built-in tempo, but can de-digivolve and remove Digimon and Tamers, is an incredibly powerful card. So the fact that it can remove Tamers is very relevant, because now that card's existence means that any deck that's trying to leverage its usage of its Tamers is going to be significantly harder, especially if more and more Machinedramons play in that particular way. So that's going to make a deck like Cross Hearts do even worse. So now the Cross Hearts have to avoid the Machinedramon players, otherwise they kind of just auto-lose that matchup. Not necessarily saying they auto-lose, but it's not going to be a very favorable matchup for them. And a card like Machinedramon, one of its big weaknesses is due to source stripping. So you have a card in a deck like Imperial Dramon with their tamer. Not only now does Machinedramon have a way to out that tamer to prevent them from source stripping efficiently, but from being able to play out their Digimon and enacting their gameplay. So that's going to make it harder for Imperial to work, but let's just say Imperial is able to fight through that, and now they have another bad matchup in the form of Rocks and Minerals, because, oh, I wanted to source strip stuff from Machinedramon, but I got paired up with Rocks and Minerals, who want to be source stripped to begin with. That's just going to make my game plan worse, because now they're going to use their abilities, which previously was supposed to be done on their turn, during my turn now, because I decided to play with this one specific mechanic. So because of the existence of Rocks and Minerals, that's actually going to make Machinedramon do better, because now one of the weaknesses that it could have through other decks is now not necessarily going to be as highly prominent or prevalent. So you could kind of start to see, like, the ripple effects that specific cards and specific abilities are having when it comes to how decks are actually going to be performing. And I'm not saying everything is stemming from Vademon. I'm just saying these are the small little ripples that we have to think about when it comes to the more finite details on how these meta matchup spreads are happening, and why certain decks are able to win over others, because you could have decks that are very favorable into, let's just say, the top deck, but if it can't beat the rest of the 9 that are also doing incredibly well, because let's just say it's just too slow and all of the other 9 decks below it are able to just OTK or deal lots of damage, then it's not like your one matchup into the best deck is actually going to be that relevant. It is still going to be relevant because that's how that'll get into like a random stray top 16, but it's not necessarily relevant in the grand scheme of things because it might not be able to handle some of the rest of the top meta contenders. So that's the type of stuff that you have to actually think about, is where does your deck fit in the confines of the meta and what the meta is playing like, to be able to see how, one, you're going to handle that, and two, what your answers to each of the top meta contending decks are. This is partially why a lot of the top meta decks try to remove as much player agency as possible, so that way they don't even have to think about how they fit in the confines of the meta. They just know if they do their thing, they're going to win the game no matter what. And that's like an incredibly powerful factor that is making these decks succeed. And it's not like this is the only format some of these decks have been around, because this is why I am not necessarily like super thrilled with the current state of competitive Digimon, because even if we go to like some of the older formats, we could still see a lot of those topping decks still be the topping decks of previous formats. So that's why the meta hasn't necessarily evolved and changed, because like, hey, look, there's Digimon, there's Imperial Digimon, there's Purple Hybrids, there's Gallantmon X, there's Royal Knights, there's Sakuya, even though like right now Royal Knights and Sakuya are quelled, in BT23 and beyond, it looks like they're going to be getting some more support, so they could very easily come back into the meta because of those new support tools. So it's not like the ban and restriction list really actually did anything to quell those decks. It's just a temporary pause on them, and they're still going to be able to be highly playable and highly effective when they get their new tools. Even though they can still do well right now, it's just they're struggling a little bit because of the current pacing of the rest of the game. But I digress, and you could see like just off of the last format that we came from, a lot of these decks are still in there, and we could even go back even further to almost an entire year ago and still see a lot of these decks still prominent and show up. There's Galaxy, there's Gallant, there's Leviamon, there's Imperial Dramon. So like these decks just have not gone away for almost at least 6 months to a year now, depending on the deck that you're actually looking at and talking about. And that's why I'm not like super thrilled, is because this is putting a huge stress and strain on the game to either A, keep up, or B, get out. And most of the time, based on how these decks have been designed, most decks are getting out. They can't compete, they can't do well, and that's really unfortunate, because some of the most fun when it comes to Digimon is actually low-level Digimon, where players are actually able to react and respond, bob and weave, and do their gameplay and not feel completely shut out by what the opponent is doing, because the opponent's deck doesn't let the opponent interact with them in any way, shape, or form. And I'm not necessarily saying having a single deck or a small set of decks be able to be competitively viable even a year past it when it was initially released is a problem. I, if anything, think that's actually a pretty good thing, knowing that I don't necessarily need to change up my deck that much in order to still compete in this environment if I take a couple of sets off of a break. I just need to relearn some matchups and I'm pretty much good to go. Well, I guess at this point you don't even need to learn any matchups, because if your deck is just like one of those OTK decks, then you just need to know how to OTK and then you're still good to go. But again, the fact is, even if we go back to like Special Booster 2.0 or EX8, which was pretty much almost a year ago, we're still going to see a lot of the decks that we're currently topping even in this type of a format, which can be its own problem, because now I don't necessarily feel like I need to invest into future sets. So as a business, that's an issue, because now I'm forced to, like, as a company, I need to either power creep to sell the new stuff, or I just need to basically take the risk of it doing terrible. And as we've seen with some of the set prices and booster box prices, they're at pretty much an all-time low because nothing has been really standing out in terms of forcing and demanding players to need to buy and invest in the set. So again, that's not necessarily doing well for Bandai when it comes to card design and set design. So it's really putting a stress and strain on the game, because if I go to, let's just say, a Leviamon deck from a year ago, we could see that there's like barely any changes that have been made to the deck as a whole, and like, yeah, that's cool and all, but again, that's its own separate issue, where if this is a deck that's continuously topping, then and it's proving to be one of the stronger decks in the current environment still, then what's my incentive to actually change anything? Outside of like, oh, maybe this does need a ban and restriction to kind of quell it and slow it down and take it back a peg. And it is up to overall play rate rather than the deck's overall strength to determine how frequently it's going to appear. Then you either need to A, make your new stuff that much more appealing or that much more powerful. And well, right now, they're trying to lean heavily on the appeal approach rather than the power approach, which I think is good. But the fact that we've already had so much bans and restrictions as is, and each ban and restriction update is getting larger and larger, and the amount of impacts it has is minimal, is a cause for concern in of itself. This is probably what's leading to my overall apathy personally with the Digimon card game, is the fact that nothing really felt like it's changed, and it's getting boring and stale, because when I'm facing in competitive events Leviamon over and over again for the past year, that's something I really don't want to see anymore. I know what the deck does, and sometimes my deck, if I'm changing up my deck and I'm playing something else, might not be able to play against it, and that's the disheartening part, is the new stuff isn't actually being able to compete with the old stuff. And I'm not saying it needs to be power crept in order to compete, because they could design stuff on a similar power level, and I felt like their set design has actually been pretty good at not power creeping the game in the past year, but as a result, this past year has just been incredibly stale and incredibly boring, and that's not necessarily leading to good and engaging gameplay, because the gameplay that we are trying to strive and achieve for is hyper quick, hyper consistent, and uninteractive gameplay, which if that's the gameplay that's getting stale, then that's going to be another issue in of itself. Point is, I'm not trying to like dump on the game. I'm just trying to explain where the current state of the game is in my perspective based on all of the data that we're seeing. And I'm not saying EX10 as a format is a bad format. We have plenty of decks to play, which is good, even if a lot of the decks are incredibly samey, which is not good. And obviously, the ban and restriction list that we just had is very much not impactful enough to actually change up the game that it should be, especially if they're not willing to try to quell some of the decks that have been topping for a year on end. They're trying to take some of the more degenerate stuff out, which I do think is a good thing, but they need to look past that and thinking about utilizing the ban and restriction list to try to elevate other styles of gameplay and other decks, so that way the newer sets actually have room and time to breathe. And set release is its own separate thing. I'm not even going to be getting into that, but that is another factor that they have to think about, is speed in which sets are being released is also confining and constricting certain sets from doing well, because again, if some of these older decks are still that super powerful and are topping formats on end, then again, I don't have incentive to buy into this new set, especially if the next one's only coming out a month later. So yeah, I think that there's still a lot of good within Digimon, and there's still a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of issues that they need to fix. But as far as the overall state of the game, I think it's fine. It could obviously be better, and that's my frustration, is the fact that I want it to be better, and it's not improving that much is my own personal fault. So feel free to tell me your thoughts about any of this down in the comments below. If you liked this video, you already know what to do with the YouTube and social media doobly-doo thing. Leave that like and subscribe, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Later.